how do you connect what's happening in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, to what's happening in Gaza?
It's the exact same thing. It's part and parcel. And I would argue that they're using the media's focus on Gaza, relative focus on Gaza, to advance what Israel and Zionism's real focus is, which is to drive Palestinians off their homes in the West Bank across all of historic Palestine.
Welcome back to another episode of The Tea with Myriam François, the show where we bring the world's most urgent conversations to a screen near you. Before we get into the episode, I just want to take a tiny moment to ask you to do one thing for me. Hit that subscribe button now. We are a small, independent team, no big network, no corporate backing here, just a handful of people who care deeply about having honest conversations and shining a light on what often goes unseen or unheard. If our work resonates with you too, click subscribe now and join us on Patreon, link in our bio. Today, we are joined by Emmy-nominated journalist, producer, and actor Ahmed Shihab-Eldin, digital storyteller, fearless voice for Palestinian rights, and a much-needed challenger of mainstream narratives. As headlines keep spinning and repression of protest and free speech hits new highs, especially when it comes to Palestine, Ahmed brings his signature insight on media bias, identity, and what it means to tell the truth in the age of disinformation. Stick around for a real talk that gets behind the hashtags and headline noise. Ahmed, welcome to the show.
It's so good to be here with you.
Yay, we are overdue. Thank you for being here. I wish it was under better circumstances. I wish we could be having a joyous conversation, because I know that there is one overdue at some point. We will have that one.
We will have it
Inshallah.
one day, inshallah.
But in the meantime, if I may, many people will have known you for your fearless journalism over the years. And over the last 20 months, you've become a reference point for many people who are not finding the news that they need to hear in legacy media. That means you've kind of had to take on a role despite yourself. Is that how you feel about it? Because that's how it looks from the outside.
Interesting framing. I haven't thought about it in that sense, but I guess that could be true. I think for me, having worked for so many different mainstream media organizations, there was one thing that was true no matter where I was. And that is that whether it's because of corporate interests or what have you, there was a stifling of truth rather than an advancement of truth or an advancement of accurate information, particularly when it comes, of course, to Palestine or any oppressed or occupied people, but even Puerto Rico. There were so many examples where I think there was a real limitation to not just the facts that could be reported about a myriad of issues that challenged either corporate power or political and geopolitical domination, imperialism. And I found that to be exhausting. And also the reason I went into journalism, I'm sure you can relate, when you go into journalism, you want to not necessarily only hold the powerful to account, but you want to inform the public. And sadly, to put it plainly, the mainstream media, I think in the UK, in the US, in Europe, and in large swaths of the world, doesn't do that. It doesn't inform the public. It wants to keep the public at bay, if you know what I mean. It doesn't want to be transparent or accountable, and so it uses objectivity. I mean, that was clear to me when I was in my early 20s, before I was working as a journalist. When I went to, Columbia is a great university, the journalism school there, but then we've seen how they've capitulated, is putting it lightly, under the Trump administration's authoritarianism and fascism. So for me, it was always strange, this idea of like adopting a view from nowhere, advancing objectivity, focusing so much on that what you're actually doing is sort of obfuscating the truth, the reality on the ground. And I think nowhere is that more painfully and painfully obvious than in Israel and Palestine.
And what was it about your personal story, for those who don't know you personally, that kind of has driven you to be this fearless voice and in many ways challenge your colleagues, challenge the industry over the standards within it?
I think, I'm originally Palestinian. I say originally because both my parents were born there. My dad left in 1948. My mom left in 1967 with their families. Um, and so this search for belonging and identity that I think so many of us experience in our formative years was particularly pronounced for me because I was moving, shuttling, between East and West, all these different places in the world. And I think the one thing that for me that has driven sort of my focus on human rights and social justice is that, at the end of the day, and it sounds cheesy, but we all want the same things. Parents and children in Gaza want the same things more or less that parents and children want here. And so when I started to see the way in which the media and political establishment wants to perpetuate the status quo, even when that status quo is so destructive and so oppressive and so repressive to so many, it only sort of drove me like it put something inside me where I wanted to make sense for the audience and for the public. I wanted to remind people that which we have in common rather than what divides us, because I think, again, the mainstream media loves to focus on fear and division because it distracts from imperialism and division.
Different kinds of division. Well, let me ask you a little bit about a news headline that I was watching this morning, because this headline to me could have been written a year ago. It could have been written 19 months ago. And that was Sky News this morning reporting that Israel, quote unquote, deeply regrets bombing Gaza's Holy Family Church, so Gaza's only Catholic church, where they killed 3 people and wounded 9. What do you make of our colleagues' continued reporting of Israel's statements in response to these sorts of instances as regretful, a mistake, an error? There are quite a few errors, are there not, Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, the pattern is clear for anyone who wants to see it, right? Anyone who's a critical thinker, anyone who's paying attention. And I guess my answer to you would be about the mainstream media or our colleagues who continue to sort of peddle and propagate and prioritize Israel's narrative, which has no credibility because they've lied time and time again. When they killed all those paramedics, when they buried them, before the video came out, they lied about it. Then when the video came out, it was suddenly a mistake. And my answer would be, I think the Pope himself, who issued a statement on X that I think can only be described as shameful and embarrassing for him, quite frankly, as the leader of the Catholic Church, to regret the loss of life. Much like how, Palestinians in the mainstream media tend to have died passively. And, the perpetrator, whether it's the New York Times or the Guardian or Sky News, is rarely, if ever, named. And the Pope chose not to name the perpetrator as well, as if the 84-year-old woman, who was killed, among those who were killed, I should say, because it wasn't just her, just died.
It just died.
She just died.
We don't really know how or why or who did it. It's just a thing that happened. I mean, there are so many things we could talk about when it comes to, I suppose, journalistic malpractice. But there's one I do want to talk to you about, because we've seen quite a few of our colleagues, even those who recognize the difficulties within the industry of challenging the Israeli narrative, dedicating their awards to fellow Palestinian journalists, kind of highlighting the courage of their colleagues in Gaza, albeit that, hundreds have died in essentially the line of duty, covering stories that we then reuse on our major networks, and which our networks obviously make money off. And on that note, I don't know if you saw a recent report by the Palestinian feminist media platform NAWA, the Now News Network, which revealed that the BBC had been commissioning journalists in Gaza, allegedly using their work, but not paying them or crediting them. Now, I'm sad to say that I'm aware that this is not exclusive to the BBC.
Sure.
there have been exploitative practices in journalism from day one. But I do want to ask you where this particular story fits into your understanding of how the industry operates. I mean, how exceptional is this story? Is it something that is like, yet again, we're seeing Palestinian journalists being, demeaned by the industry, by their colleagues? Or is this actually part of a wider pattern that's been happening to journalists in the global south for quite some time?
I think both those things can be true, but I'd agree with you that this is a continuation of a policy, a strategy by mainstream media to put profit over people. And, the dehumanization of Palestinians over decades, I think, has reached such depths amidst this unfolding genocide. And it's not just Palestinians, as you say, in the global south. I think there's always been exploitative practices. But I mean, let's be honest, Myriam. In the eyes of the mainstream media, the political establishment, the media establishment, Palestinian lives are expendable, disposable, are not valued. So why would they pay journalists? I mean, again, I'm not trying to overstate it, but I think the level of dehumanization that has taken hold in the halls of power, whether in the media or the political realm, cannot be overstated. And that causes a willful blindness. I had Gabor Mate on my podcast the other week, and the reason I mention this is because he said something unsolicited that I thought was really accurate. He said, when I brought up the New York Times and sort of some of their problematic coverage, to put it very lightly, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, he said, well, you'd have to be, I think it was willfully blind to be the bureau chief of the New York Times. And I just think it really highlighted to me, it's like, I sometimes wonder, because I've worked at all these places, and so have you, in many of these places, I should say, are these people not thinking critically? Are they unaware? Do they not see the truth? And are they failing at reporting it? And what I worry is the truth. Is it that they know the truth and they want to do whatever they can to either conceal it or obfuscate it?
So this bit I find easier to understand than the people on the sidelines around them who are not involved or implicated directly, but who presumably enter journalism like most of us do with a quest for truth, a desire to reveal, dark practices, hold power to account, etc. Those are the people, frankly, that confuse me. Because if I'm looking around my newsroom and I'm observing, which I think wouldn't be particularly hard at this point, that all of my colleagues seem to be taking, press releases from the IDF as gospel. I don't know. I feel like maybe I might want to raise my hand. I may want to, I don't know, stick my neck out for this one. It seems like a pretty important one. Tens of thousands of kids and, millions of people's lives on the line. I don't know, just they're the ones that confuse me, because I understand that there are ideologically motivated people within this industry. We meet them all the time. Unfortunately, there are people in our industry who think it's completely okay to refer to, the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. I just listened to a news report this morning on American TV where the correspondent uses the term Judea and Samaria. I'm sorry, what? Are we now using the Bible as a reference for how we discuss news?
Well, I think what you're describing is what we were talking about before we started recording, which is, even today with the bombing of the Catholic Church, with all the various atrocities. I mean, there are crimes against humanity being committed on a daily basis, dozens of times. And that alone makes it hard to report, right? Just the sheer pace and the momentum with which they're committing these crimes. But when these crimes occur, the media says, Israel says it was a mistake. And they advance these lies. They advance the gaslighting narrative of Israel, the propaganda playbook. And in doing so, when you say Israel says, a simple question. Israel is committing mass murder. That is an objective fact. Whether they have a right to do it because self-defense, that's a whole other issue that I don't want to get into. But that alone should make you wonder why the media chooses to prioritize that narrative when they start saying Israel says, rather than say Israel killed, Israel, the absence of them saying Israel killed, and then the frequency with which they use Israel's defense as a lead in a story, I think sadly tells you all you need to know.
And it's disturbing to me because without clarity around how it is that this happens in newsrooms all around the world, I fear that it actually feeds into conspiracy theories around, control and, who's running what and actually really murky stuff where it's like, if you work in that newsroom, surely you know who has formally told you, I'm sorry, you're going to have to correct that headline. Who has sent you the memo that says, when we report this, we refer to the IDF's statements? Like, name and shame. Isn't that the job?
It is, but Myriam, the simple answer is it's self-preservation. It's the fact that, and I hate to try to boil it down to make it so reductive, but, the same way that I described the media at large, mainstream media, putting profit over people, in a way, these people who might know better but will remain silent. Look, self-censorship is something I even had to engage with early on in my career when I was working at the New York Times, when I was working at some of these institutions. Looking back, it's always 2020. It wasn't even intentional sometimes.
Yeah.
And the reason I didn't last at a lot of these places and I ended up quitting and moving on to the next place and then going back to a place like Al Jazeera is specific to my truth, which is that I'm Palestinian, and it was hard to continue to work for me at a place that was so clearly advancing a narrative and concealing a narrative that continued to cause so much destruction to Palestine. But yeah, these individuals, you want a promotion, you want to keep your job, you want to get ahead, you got to play the game.
But with all due respect, now that they've done all of that, will there even be a New York Times to work at in a couple of years? Will there be, a Guardian? Because, I'm not a huge New York Times reader, but I was a Guardian reader. Do I continue to read The Guardian today? I do not.
Yeah, neither
do I continue to refer to some of the outlets that I used to go to and trust, like the BBC? I do not. And I'm not alone. You're not alone. We know this is a trend. So you think you're preserving yourself by not telling the truth?
I agree.
In fact, you're destroying our very industry and the basis of trust. And I don't know if you fear this, Ahmed, but me personally, it's that I fear not just a distrust that's happening of legacy media, which we're also critical of, but I fear the distrust of everything and anything, to the point where people are much more easily manipulated by individuals who are planted by, in many cases, the funding of foreign governments, and these are all traceable things, this is in the public domain, who then become these sort of intellectual icons, these sort of lights that you follow because they understand, naming no names, but you can find who is dominating YouTube and then look up who funds them, and you'll realize very quickly that however critical you are of public funded broadcasting, I don't know about you, I personally would rather a faulted public broadcaster than a ton of privately funded YouTubers.
Yeah, but I do think that they become less and less not only credible but relevant to the public and the masses, but where they remain upheld is in the halls of power.
Yeah, no.
And the collusion that exists
absolutely
here and across the pond between mainstream media institutions, not just who funds them, but access, the guests you're going to bring on. But yeah, I think we're having a little bit of a media revolution. You look at DropSite in the US, Zateo, even your podcast, and your podcast, which is not, a traditional form of a media organization that's challenging the mainstream because it's a specific form, right? But yeah, people are hungry, not just for truth, but for the origin of what media, journalism should be about, beyond holding the powerful to account, just simply constructively, contextually reporting facts. That is not happening at the New York Times. What is happening at these mainstream media organizations is quite the contrary. The deliberate attempt to obscure facts, to advance geopolitical agendas, to advance the status quo, which keeps money in the pockets of the people who are supporting not just the colonialism, but look, at the end of the day, this is about domination more broadly. This is about imperialism. I mean, it's 2025, and all these age-old strategies to control the masses are still alive and well, and we're seeing it unfold. And we're trying to fight it, and I think we will succeed once the stakes become clearer to more and more people.
That is a question I pose myself a lot, whether what the sort of tipping point looks like and where people go from there, right? Once you do have the sort of scales fall from your eyes and you're suddenly like, oh, we're actually in really deep. I think we're in a lot deeper into authoritarian surveillance fascism than most people really recognize, sadly. And I don't like to be, overly alarmist. But what I observe in terms of the deterioration of our freedoms over just the last 2 years contextually tells me that we are on a path that is really, really concerning. It may be that in the next few years, we do not recognize the societies that we live in. And I say this, I have a friend visiting me from the States. She teaches at a university in America. I knew this in theory, but when she said it, and she was like, we are no longer allowed to teach colonialism and anti-racist history at the university.
The desperation of empire is so obvious.
I mean, yes, but also like, can we take a minute for this? You're not allowed to teach colonial history at an American university?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, sadly. Maybe if you said it a few years ago.
Yeah, well, this is it. So this is what I mean about the speed, right? And then the other thing that she said, where we had a back and forth, she was like, so this is not my normal phone. Me and most of my colleagues now, we don't travel with our phones. We have these burner phones. And of course, we're all hearing about these burner phone situations. But I was like, is this not an adaptation to fascism that we should, in and of itself, be fighting? At what point do we continue to find maneuvers to avoid, coming up against the hard end of a fascistic government versus recognizing that we're not going to outrun these people. We're not going to be able to avoid, confronting them. You don't find accommodations with fascists, right? You don't negotiate a middle ground with these people.
True. Yeah, I mean, I guess what comes to mind when you talk about this is sort of, Snowden, Julian Assange, these attempts in recent decades to expose the nascent efforts to really control the masses in such a way. I mean, what we're witnessing on Palestine is what we're witnessing at large, I think, which is what you're describing, which is a very well-coordinated, well-funded, and all the more sophisticated because of AI and these powerful tools behind Palantir and these other companies that are, Palantir just had $100 million contract with the US government 2003, several hundred million 2004, and now $1 billion contract. A company whose AI is being used, as you know, to target and kill children and civilians in Palestine. But this is much broader, and I think it's a criminalization and a demonization of dissent, of those who, even just asking questions of power can get you erased, prosecuted. Look at the UK. You have old women notifying the police on the issue of Palestine action that they support their right to protest, to do civil disobedience, and they hold a sign and sit down in a park and they notify the police beforehand, purely peaceful, and they're arrested?
I mean, even beyond that, did you see recently a video circulating of a woman holding up a sign at a roundabout just saying, "I stand with Palestine, free Palestine"? And the police came and they basically tried to claim that the prescription of Palestine Action meant that any signage that basically said, "I support Palestine" or "I condemn Israel" could be perceived, could be interpreted as support for a prescribed organization.
You said we won't recognize our societies potentially in 3 years. That can sound alarmist. That can sound even extreme. But I think it's accurate. I think we're heading into, the middle classes are shrinking in these sort of supposedly democratic societies. And what is permissible in terms of expressing your views, whether on Palestine or anything else, is being tightly controlled. But look, fear is a age-old motivator, something that is an age-old emotion that is exploited to control the masses.
Totally.
And I think we're witnessing that, whether the masses are the public or the masses are the masses of journalists in newsrooms, the fear is palpable.
You mentioned facts, so let's talk a few facts on the Palestine issue. So
Sure.
UNICEF just announced that there are 28 children a day who've been killed for the last 20 months. That's an entire classroom of Palestinian children. Millions are starving. There's no more baby formula. We have seen former Israeli ambassador Michael Oren, who has just filmed defending a plan to forcibly transfer around 2 million Palestinians into enclosed camps atop the ruins of Rafah as part of Trump's Mediterranean Riviera plan.
Yeah, of which Tony Blair's office was involved.
Well, indeed. I mean, were we not done with Tony Blair? Like, did he need another stint in the Middle East? I thought there was enough shame to last a couple of decades.
You would think so. And then I saw him a few months ago at Davos interviewing the new Syrian foreign minister. And it just made me say, like, how is this where we are? And this man is being given the credibility to even have such a discussion. I mean, yeah.
I mean, which man? Because that could be posed of both people in that context.
Well, what I was going to say, I mean, the region is, I mean, look, they just bombed the Syrian Ministry of Defense, or, the headquarters, I should say, live on camera, like during a broadcast. And then you see sort of this tepid criticism from Arab states. And I mean, I don't know if people realize Arabs, Muslims, these leaders, I don't just mean the leaders of these Arab governments, because, for as much as we've sat here and criticized the West, let's be frank, we celebrate Ramadan, giving alms to the poor, these Islamic values, not just Islamic values, but, human values. And yet famine is widespread. Man-made famine is widespread. And I just wonder, like, they're sounding the alarms, whether it's the UN or the Palestinians themselves. And again, it's the choosing of profit over people. And you're choosing to show your solidarity with a system, capitalism, that is unfettered, that is, out of control, and choosing to prioritize that over the well-being of either your citizens or your brothers and sisters in the Muslim world or in the Arab world. And I just think eventually that spells peril for us all.
Well, I think it does, and it's particularly interesting to look at that example because I was speaking with Bassem Youssef recently, and obviously he's someone who was raised in Egypt, who had to flee Egypt, obviously because of persecution from the government. I should say governments, plural, actually. Always good when there's multiple competing, governments that hate each other, all pursuing you simultaneously. Usually a sign you're doing a good job as a journalist or as a comedian.
True.
But what was interesting was he was saying that, in Egypt, there's this. He's not the first person to tell me this. I have many Egyptian friends. There's so much fear, right? There's so much fear because the levels of surveillance and police state intrusion into your life. I mean, let's be honest. The last elected president of Egypt died tortured to death in an Egyptian prison, right? That was the elected president, Mohamed Morsi. Regardless of how anyone feels about his election, that fact alone should scare and terrify anyone that the elected president could die in those circumstances. And what message does that, of course, send to your average Joe about speaking up in any capacity? But on the kind of issue of fear, I think that fear is now settling into our contexts. So that fear that you observe in authoritarian settings, like, of course, if you live and travel in the Middle East, or if you know the Middle East well, you know what we're talking about, right? It's the hush thing. It's the one that's like, you're going to talk about something and people will be like, not here. Or like, you know.
Yeah, story of my life when I'm there.
Yeah. Right.
Especially these days.
So, and we've kind of known this, right? These are conversations you would have in very much the privacy of your own home and even then careful about who's around. But it feels like we're almost like getting there here now, where it's like people are scared to make certain comments in public. I had somebody the other day say to me, do you think it's okay if I wear a T-shirt that says Palestine in the street?
I know. I mean, look, democracy is not having its best decade. If you think your civil liberties are protected, you know, there's a baseline protection. And yet, you know, authoritarianism and fascism is not just creeping in. It's being upheld. It's being, again, propagated by the media. You know what I'm trying to say is, like, in the Middle East, people will tell me, and have for a long time, oh, well, just don't say that too loud. And what you're describing is that here we are in the West, which likes to kind of like see itself as superior morally, you know, and that's the big illusion that I think so many people around the world, whether they're third culture kids, whether they grew up in the West and they're white and privileged and have never left the West, once you start to see that shift that we've described happening and impacting, if not your life, the lives of people around you, the journalist that just got arrested, the activist who, you know, what have you, you start to realize that we're all unsafe. And that unsafety, I hope, will lead us to action, people taking more concrete, tangible steps. I mean, you know, the Francesca of it all being sanctioned, you know, an unprecedented sanctioning of a UN official, all because she did her job, all because she documented a genocide, all because she connected dots between businesses and corporations, and because she plainly stated, I mean, this was the threat. Is it a coincidence she was sanctioned by the US government a few days after her most recent report about corporations like Microsoft, like Palantir, like so many corporations that are profiting off this genocide? And if she hadn't been so effective with her rhetoric and her lovely Italian accent, being able to make the truth so accessible to so many, she would not have been perceived as the threat that she is. And the threat that she is simply because she's saying what we all are wondering, which is why 2 years into an unfolding genocide, has there been virtually no concrete steps taken, not just to hold Israel accountable or the US, but to end the genocide. And the simple reason is because it makes so many people who are in power a lot of money.
So this is, I think, such a huge scandal on multiple levels, right? One, obviously, is the report itself and the implications of the report, which is that actually so many of the companies that so many of us rely on day to day are profoundly intertwined with the genocide. Scandal one. But scandal two, surely, is the lack of pickup of this report in and of itself. And scandal three is that it isn't even just that, you know, Europe, for example, has done nothing. It's actually increased trade with Israel during the genocide, which is, you know, I mean, poses significant questions around the idea that we are actually profiting in some way, because I don't think the facts are in question. So what are we saying? Like, oh, it kind of doesn't matter if they're doing this because we're making some money off of it?
The reason they sanctioned her, to your very point, is they couldn't engage her on the facts. And by they, I mean not just these corporations. Sure, some of them might have because they're worried about their bottom line. It, of course, has nothing to do with morality. But that's okay. Let that be the motivator for them to look in the mirror and sort of change their approach and change their investment and divest from this genocidal rogue regime. But more worrying, not just for Francesca, but for us all, is the member states that have completely abandoned their legal obligations, which is what Francesca, that is the common refrain that I think is so unsettling and disarming and dangerous, perceived as dangerous by the member states, because she plainly is reminding powerful countries around the world of their legal obligations, as the ICJ did, to prevent genocide, which, it's one thing to not take the steps you're required to take by international law to prevent genocide, but then you're actively arming and facilitating and enabling and shielding Israel, which is committing the genocide. So yeah, it's hard to not see the juxtaposition. A few days before Francesca is sanctioned, the U.S. Congress stands up and applauds a war criminal who's wanted by the ICC. The ICC, which was created to prevent genocides, to prevent crimes against humanity in its entire history. Did you know they've never prosecuted anyone for the crime of genocide, despite all the genocides that have happened since the ICC? It's maddening. I mean,
I did know that a lot of these courts are referred to as the courts of African leaders, right? Because we never see white people on trial.
But even in the case of Sudan and, Bashir, they did not. It was crimes against humanity and war crimes. And then, there's this perception that, they didn't charge them with the crime of genocide because, it's hard to prove intent. And there's truth to that.
Sure.
But do you think that the powers that be are going to allow Israel, the state that has defined its raison d'être as we endured a genocide and therefore we deserve to exist? That's essentially the narrative, right? We endured the Holocaust almost like, and I hate to put it in these terms, but this is how I feel in this moment, that they have a monopoly on being victims of mass murder and ethnic cleansing. You think that the world is going to allow the ICC, the ICJ, anybody to hold them accountable for those very same crimes, even though they are committing those very same crimes?
And even though the reality of human psychology is that actually when you experience deep and profound trauma, there is a high likelihood of you then replicating those patterns, right? It's bully, right?
Yeah. Hurt people. Hurt
people. But there's also, I do want to put this out into the public domain so we're absolutely clear. Israel does love to put forward this narrative that, it was created because, it had to provide a home after the Holocaust. The idea of Zionism and the idea of Jews ethnically cleansing Palestinian land in order to create a sort of biblical homeland for themselves existed long predated the Holocaust, right? Long predated the Holocaust. So the Holocaust happens long after this idea of, Jews having a homeland in this part of the world. So yes, it's a justification given, but it doesn't also tally up with the evidence of why and when this argument began. And in fact was at the time largely reviled by European Jews, it should be said. The report you're referring to by Francesca Albanese, it's obviously evidence of the trade and financial support for Israel, and she's urging states and private entities to kind of completely abstain from involvement within this system. She lists corporations like Microsoft, Alphabet, and Caterpillar, who can actively profit from, enable, or even help design systems of mass violence with almost no democratic oversight. Do you think we've reached a point now where these companies are not just complicit, but are actually driving policy? Because that's, I think, the confluence of private power and political power that I think is really defining of the juncture that we find ourselves at.
Well said. I think, I endorse that. Put that on a mug and a shirt.
And I want to ask you as well about something that's a little bit confusing to me, which is that, war historically is kind of thought to be bad for economies. So let's take a couple of examples. During World War I, stocks fell sharply. The same happened during World War II. Ukraine's GDP dropped over 30% in 2022 after the Russian invasion. The Iraq War cost the US over $3 trillion. But during the recent Gaza assault by Israel, this Tel Aviv Stock Exchange actually soared at the same time that US weapons companies saw huge record profits. So, how is the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange soaring when there are missiles landing there? I don't make it make sense.
It soared by 213%, amassing 225 billion in market gains, including 67 billion in just, I think, 2 months alone. Why is that happening? It's because Israel is propped up by governments and corporations that are profiting off of the technology that is being tested on the Palestinian population, which is being presented to the world as a population that not only is not deserving of human rights and dignity and freedom, but that are not fully human, you know? And it's like we've come to the point where shamelessly or with no shame, online, these organizations and companies are promoting their ability to unleash horror against civilians and framing it as like a positive and something to be marketed. And I'm sure it is then purchased and marketed. And, you know, let's not get into India and all these other governments that are very, very beyond complicit with the Israeli regime, not just with the genocide, but with emboldening and, you know, uplifting these companies that are directly committing crimes against humanity on a daily basis. So,
and we are about to have, I think, one of the biggest arm fairs here in the UK at the Excel in London in September, and there will be Israeli weapons companies here selling us, you know, how fabulous their sanitized arms are. You know, people will wander around looking at videos of how effective this machinery is.
And if I may quickly, sorry, you know, we look to governments like Spain, Ireland, in the context of Europe, that are speaking out, that are maybe saying we should stop selling arms.
And Belgium, which has just ruled to do just that.
Right. And then you have the, you know, Prime Minister of Spain, Sanchez, saying, you know, we don't, verbatim, we don't give weapons or sell weapons to a genocidal regime, of course referring to Israel. But of course that's not true. Of course they still do. And the reason they do, to get to the question you were asking earlier, is because of these, the dependency that Spain has on Israeli weapons manufacturers, or specifically, I should say, cyber surveillance tools and technologies. It's not the first time that politicians say one thing, you know, with their mouth and then do another thing. But you know, whether their hands are tied or not, like if you're gonna say that you're doing that, you should stop, even if it's gonna mean. I mean, the argument is that Spain is gonna suffer. Spain's security will suffer because they rely on these Israeli technologies for Spain's national security. But
sounds like there's a huge market opportunity for an alternative tech company to, you know, provide some great services in line with the ethics and principles of 21st century global politics. I don't know.
I hope.
Just putting it out there, Tech for Palestine.
Get on it. Get on it. The poor guy, he's doing a lot.
Yeah, that one guy.
Yeah, that one guy.
Here at The Tea, we are all about cutting through the noise and giving you real, balanced conversations. And that's why we love using Ground News. Ground News shows you how different news outlets cover the same story, and their blind spot feed reveals stories that one side of the political spectrum just isn't talking about. For instance, this week, Kamala Harris was mocked for recognizing the 1-year anniversary of her 2024 failed presidential campaign. Ground News helps you understand how stories are framed, who's ignoring what, and why that matters. It's become an essential part of how we research for The Tea. It's shocking sometimes to see what we're not seeing. We use Ground News to make sure we're bringing you the full picture. And as a loyal tea drinker, you can subscribe to Ground News today and get unlimited access at 40% of their Vantage plan to see the world beyond your feed and stay informed without the spin. Check it out at ground.news/The Tea. We thank Ground News for sharing our dedication to showing the whole story and for supporting our community and our independence. I wanted to come back just briefly on this topic of international law because It's obviously not the first time that we've seen Israel flouting international law, despite numerous UN resolutions to try and rein it in. So it's not exactly news that Israel does not care much for international law. I think what's new about where we find ourselves now is that it appears to be the case that Israel is almost single-handedly, with a little help from the US, dismantling the entire system of international law. And I just want us to take a second to discuss the implications of that. So let's roll back a second and remind ourselves why the system of international law exists, right? I'm a European. My grandfather was a teenager when the Nazis invaded France. He and my grandma had to flee for their lives from fascism. It was a choice between heading to the hills to join the resistance or become a collaborator, which unfortunately many French people did also do. We celebrate the heroes who became the resistance in France, but that's not the only story of what happened. And I guess the aftermath of the Second World War was like, this was the second time in Europe we'd had millions of people die in a huge war within Europe. And so we decide, in the aftermath, we have to create a system that allows us to account one another, different states, without going to war. We need a system that's going to maintain peace in the world through a shared framework of reference. Now, why would Israel not only wish to dismantle international law, but why is it managing so successfully this time around to dismantle that entire system? I don't just mean UNRWA, right? I mean the fact that today that, whether it's holding the leaders of Israel to account, and there being sanctions and threats against people like Karine Khan, the chief prosecutor, or the fact that, the principles of like the Genocide Convention don't seem to apply. It's like international law has become kind of not even a mandatory reference. It's become, a matter of opinion. Do you feel like respecting it? Do you not feel like respecting it? That's quite a shift, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the rules-based order, international law, maybe the question we should ask ourselves is, why was it set up? And who set it up? And for what purpose? Which goes back to let's prosecute an African dictator, but let's not prosecute ourselves. Tony Blair, George Bush, the Iraq War.
Right.
Has anyone been held accountable?
But are you of the camp that means we should enthusiastically dismantle? Because I think, look, that leaves us with two potential conclusions, right? One is it's never worked. Mask off, let it burn, option A. Option B, this is me revealing my colors, is the same way I feel about the BBC, by the way. I'm not a let it burn with the BBC. I believe in public broadcasting.
Yeah.
I believe it's corrupted, profoundly corrupted, but I believe in public broadcasting. I also believe in an international system of law.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, I think it's a bit of a convenient and maybe somewhat lazy argument to say let it burn, but it is burning.
It is burning.
So the question becomes, can it be extinguished, and what system will we put in place? I mean, I think my answer to that, either or, is I think we need a revolution. I know that seems like
it's what is on the back of the jacket.
Yeah, but short of a revolution, the consolidation of power amongst governments and amongst corporations, the same ones that are doing everything they possibly can to avoid holding Israel and the U.S. accountable for this genocide, much as they did in previous, crimes, as we mentioned, Iraq, Tony Blair, so on. Short of a revolution that can challenge this system that is bottom up, a revolution, I don't mean necessarily an armed revolution, but
Can there be a revolution that is unarmed?
I think there are many different ways to revolt. I think it's just really, it comes down to organizing. It comes down to, first of all, being aware. And I think the awareness is growing. As you said earlier, that, something's got to give, right? Because if we don't address these systemic issues that are oppressing so many of us, chiefly the Palestinians, but it's not just Palestinians. And that's what I always try to tell people. And another thing, let's not forget, when Israel and Zionists and Israelis dehumanize Palestinians, they are simultaneously dehumanizing themselves.
Absolutely.
And they may not realize that now. But there will come a time, and it's coming. You know, it's very convenient for people like Bernie Sanders in the US or others in Europe, European leaders, to those who do criticize or blame Netanyahu or single him out or Smotrich or his right-wing government. I mean, the other day, Daniela Weiss, this, crazy settler, was on Piers Morgan, and he, in his performative way, kept trying to hold her accountable for the tens of thousands of Palestinian children that had been killed. He wanted her and asked her repeatedly, much like he asks me repeatedly to condemn Hamas. He wanted to, before I'm able to say anything, he asked her, do you empathize? Are you capable of empathy? And unintentionally, I think he did something that was interesting, which was he got her to reveal that she had no empathy for these children and that she wasn't even able to accept the fact that Israel had killed them. So she kept obfuscating. But the problem is, we in the media, in political circles, frame her and the settlers. We create these divisions where she is extreme. Smotrich is extreme. Ben-Gvir, a convicted terrorist, by the way, is extreme. And Netanyahu is extreme. But that somehow the rest of Israeli society is not, or that Zionism itself as an ideology is not extreme and based in terrorism, as the New York Times reported in the 30s and 40s in their newspaper, calling the Haganah terrorist militias. Why were they doing that? Because at the time, they were terrorizing not just the Palestinians, but the British colonial system.
You don't say.
Yeah, so I guess so for me, it's like, it's not as if early Zionists weren't aware or did not explicitly state that in order to create the state of Israel, I'm talking after they had floated the idea of maybe putting it somewhere else, but once they had decided that it would be in the Holy Land.
The whole, maybe Uganda or Argentina
or Madagascar or whatever
Yeah.
it was, yeah. Exactly. All right. Once they decided to put it in the Holy Land, they were very clear, Myriam. And I'm working on a video with a colleague on this. They've been lying since the beginning. So when they lie about killing the paramedics or bombing the schools or killing, as we've seen, settlers have killed 5 American citizens since October 7th. Israeli settlers, and when I say settlers, protected on the ground when those murders were committed, the Israeli soldiers and army were there. So they're killing American citizens, and yet no recourse, no accountability. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's mind-blowing, but it's also deeply worrying that we're seeing this pattern unfold, and the media is not simply, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And the Zionists early on said, Israel will have to be a colonial enterprise. They might not have used the word colonial, but they definitely used the word ethnic cleansing.
Herzl did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, colonial.
Oh, yeah,
exactly.
colonial.
Exactly. Because they knew that, and they even said things that I say, in this day and age, and it's mind-boggling that they've gotten away with it for so long.
Yeah, well, for sure, because of this Hasbara technique of spreading confusion, right? It's like they're not trying to convince us of their narrative per se. They're just trying to bamboozle you where it feels like, no, this is a Palestinian narrative, but there's all these other views. And it's like, no, these are the actual words of the ideological founder of Zionism. Not my POV, people,
Exactly.
actual facts.
Exactly.
But we are here going round in circles about whether Israel is a settler colonial state. I mean, who gave Israel to the Jews? It was a place called what? Colonial Mandate Palestine?
Yeah.
So how are we not talking about a colonial underpinning to this entire conversation? How do you even avoid that? How do you have a conversation about the state of Israel today and in some capacity ignore the fact that it was created in the context of colonization? Now, you can many conclusions could flow from that statement, but even that statement is somehow disputed.
And the same way the statement Israel's committing genocide is so widely disputed, despite the fact that, as Francesca and others remind us, there is actually an international legal definition to genocide. It's not like this term that is, and I think people, as you know, misunderstand genocide to be, it has to be the murder of millions, or it has to be a certain threshold of violence and intensity, gas chambers. If you look at the way in which we allow the Israeli leaders to tell us they want to erase Gaza, they want to level it, there's no such thing as a civilian. So the intent, which is the hardest part to prove of genocide, is there. It's loud, it's clear, it's not hidden, and it's repeated, and has been for the last 2 years. It is the exact same way that the early Zionists said and admitted the Palestinian native, of course they called them Arabs, because there's no such thing as a Palestinian, we're just Arabs. They said no local native population will just willfully leave, and historically has. So we will need to ethnically cleanse them. We will need to make conditions so bad that they will leave. And it's, it's what, 80 years later, and they're continuing in that endeavor. I don't know. It's to me, it's very plain and very obvious. I think if we go back to the basics, it's hard to deny that the foundation of the Israeli state, as you say, was founded through ethnic cleansing and terrorism.
And you know what, you mentioned the idea that the term genocide has an actual definition, a legal definition to it. Mm-hmm. So I made a documentary for the BBC a few years ago on the genocide at Srebrenica, which was the genocide of 6,000 men and boys in the context of, extremist Serb forces attacking certain villages and towns, in this case, Srebrenica. Mm-hmm. The threshold there was that it was a clear intent to eliminate that ethnic group, mm-hmm. Muslim Bosniaks, as it were, from the territory. That was 6,000 people. I mean, we're looking at, probably around the 100,000 mark in Gaza today. And we haven't even talked about the West Bank yet, and we will in a second. Mm-hmm. I watched an interview just last week of a colleague at the BBC arguing with a top legal scholar over the meaning of genocide, and just saying, well, I know it's your opinion that it's genocide. And it's like, how is a journalist challenging a legal scholar on the definition of genocide? The New York Times, as you and I both know, just this week, right, published an op-ed by an Israeli genocide scholar. I mean, I don't know how much more we need to see or hear out here. We've finally got the Israeli stamp of approval, and now we can say it's truth, because otherwise we couldn't, right, if we hadn't had an Israeli confirm what others have said for a long time.
It is wild to me, Myriam, that Haaretz and the Times of Israel even are using the terms concentration camps to refer to what Israel is now doing, what the minister Katz said, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be moved into Rafah, into this humanitarian area. But they use in their headlines in Israel, I mean, imagine this. Inside the system that is committing the ethnic cleansing and genocide, the media somehow can use the terms concentration and camp to refer to what is happening. And yet, in the West,
we dispute it.
Nobody will use those terms.
What?
It is coming out of their mouths. It is being published by various news organizations within their domain. And yet, the West acts like they don't see it, acts like they don't know what a concentration camp looks like.
The maddest part is also that is contrasted with the fact that they will regularly use the idea that Hamas is a genocidal organization.
Well, every accusation is a confession with Israel. Isn't that the case?
I mean, the bar is very low, clearly, for the term being used against Hamas, because I don't think you could provide any evidence that there's been an attempt to genocidal the Israeli people. I'm not saying that horrific things didn't happen October the 7th and at other times also, but the idea that this constitutes an attempt to eliminate the population of Israel, and that somehow that is clear and obvious and truth and reported as such, but that somehow what we're seeing coming out of Israel, well, it's still not clear what exactly it is. I mean, do you watch those Twitch videos that go out of like these young, often Palestinian guys who they
meet the Israelis?
They meet these Israelis. And I feel like the wildest part of that is that obviously they don't even know who they're going to end up on, right? And so it's like spin the bottle. You never know who you're going to end up with. And systematically, they are confronted with such hatred, such dehumanization. And two of the guys that I'm thinking of are actually such sweet young men. I mean, there's one in particular, young Palestinian guy, Palestinian-American guy. Just
I know who you mean.
I'm sure you do. He's very well. I wish I could reference his name right now. But he's always so willing to kind of engage from a place of humanity. I've seen this guy met with like, I kill your kids, I kill your family, you know. And like, I've seen people in these videos be like, you know, these girls that look like they're just off of some TikTok dance video being like, I only kill 5, baby. Just 5, only 5. Like, I'm sorry, what? Are you okay? You only killed 5?
Look, Israeli society, what I was trying to get at earlier is when we blame it on Netanyahu, when we blame it on the leaders, when we blame it on the settlers, when we create these divisions, what we are not taking into account is that for better or worse, the indoctrination of Zionism and its ideology, which is, again, we agreed on, founded on ethnic cleansing and dehumanization, they are so consumed, so blinded. They don't have the capacity to empathize with Palestinians because it's a form of brainwashing, as the film, the great documentary Israelism highlights. It is a brainwashing doctrination of an entire population to not only see themselves as eternal victims and therefore, you know, deserved of this state, but as you said, it's like they're using biblical references 3,000 years old to somehow justify mass murder. It's not credible in a modern society. Imagine the Carthaginians in Tunis. They could do the same. They could say, a couple thousand years ago, we had this part of Europe, and you know what I mean?
I mean, I would just like to remind France that there was a point where the south of France was ours. Okay, so I think we have claims.
Exactly.
We have claims to lay. Anyway,
exactly.
It's obviously a joke because, hello, such an obvious one, but somehow still given some level of credibility.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this Riviera plan. I don't know if you've heard about the idea that there's going to be a digital currency used to buy land from Palestinians in Gaza. Did you hear about this? So the Trump Riviera is introducing cryptocurrency, basically promising to convert plots of land of Palestinians who, quote unquote, volunteer their land into digital tokens on a blockchain. What do you think this convergence of militarism, real estate, and digital currencies kind of tells us about the juncture that we're at right now?
That they will go to the most immoral lengths to line and fill their pockets. Again, Tony Blair, you know, these think tanks, the Institute or whatever that was involved in the Riviera plan as it was just disclosed, whether it's this digital currency, there's no scheme too dystopian or Orwellian, if they could get away with it, that they would enact and implement in order to continue their dominion at the expense of those who they perceive as not deserving of equal rights. And then the powers that be, this is my view, are going to leverage any new technology, any nascent technology. They're going to find ways of sort of making it serve their purpose.
I want to ask you about two more things. One is about what's happening in the West Bank. So Palestinian journalist Myriam François, who, if you don't follow her, you absolutely should, has been tweeting that there's a slow genocide happening in the West Bank. And most recently, she made a post on X that said it's telling that media lost interest in covering the West Bank. It goes to show that the media, legacy media or otherwise, is not interested in covering the crimes there. So an estimated 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by settlers or the military since October the 7th in the West Bank. According to the UN, the West Bank is currently going through the largest displacement since 1967. We've seen the PA cracking down on resistance in Jenin and elsewhere. How do you connect what's happening in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, to what's happening in Gaza?
It's the exact same thing. It's part and parcel. And I would argue that they're using the media's focus on Gaza, relative focus on Gaza, to advance what Israel and Zionism's real focus is, which is to drive Palestinians off their homes in the West Bank across all of historic Palestine. And the West Bank is more desirable to them, or was historically, for obvious reasons of contiguity.
Contiguity,
Yeah,
yeah.
just this idea that, I mean, again, the West Bank is also, as you rightly stated, the Palestinian Authority, for better or worse, is not just complicit, but is advancing the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the West Bank.
The PA, a lot of people who are not familiar with the issues in Palestine might be surprised to hear you say that the PA is complicit in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the PA being the Palestinian Authority. Can you clarify that for people who might not know what you mean?
Through security and military agreements for quite some time, the Palestinian Authority has facilitated the repression of dissent and resistance, both in terms of armed resistance in the West Bank, but also just any form of resistance to the occupation, to apartheid. You can just see it in the early days. People may not be aware when October 7th happened and then, Israel's attacks began. Anytime there was solidarity with resistance in Gaza and the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, with a very heavy hand, came and not only attacked their own, but, again, security cooperation means that you share information with the occupier in order to facilitate their ability to target. Many years ago, resistance fighters in the West Bank who fought the Israeli occupational army in the West Bank and
which
died.
They're legally entitled to do as an occupied people, as long as they do so within the bounds of international law.
Exactly. The Israeli government today bombed, I think, one of the things they did, I should say, is they bombed 3 family homes, killing people in these families who are related to those resistance fighters who way back when had fought. So what are they doing in doing that? And obviously these kinds of operations, these kind of attacks happen in full cooperation with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Maybe not publicly, maybe not in plain sight, but oftentimes even in plain sight. What they want to do is they want to take the human spirit of resistance that lives inside all of us, Palestinians and beyond. They want to find the most heinous, violent, intense ways to remind anybody in Palestine who resists that if you do resist, we will come for you and your family first. And in doing so, they hope to subjugate and make Palestinians feel like their only option is to surrender under oppression and occupation and ethnic cleansing. But I think they underestimate the spirit and the will to live of Palestinian people and all people.
And how do you make sense now of the question of Palestinian leadership? Because I think you and I both know that in the media, right, we so often see discussions of Palestinian issues without Palestinians present. In fact, you and I shared a panel one time where I had to insist on there being a Palestinian present for a discussion about Palestinian issues.
Yep.
And it's a pet peeve of mine, and I'm sure of yours. But there is an issue, is
and we
there
love
not?
You for it.
I mean, it's so baseline.
Obvious,
I don't need no medals, but thank you.
No, it's not a medal. We love you for it because at least you're upholding the baseline. In the abandon of others.
It seems so obvious. It seems like embarrassing to me. It's a bit like watching a bunch of men discuss women's issues. I'm like, hello, come on now.
Which we all do all the time.
Right. But there is an issue, right, of Palestinian leadership. Obviously, we're seeing now that there are a report in The Economist, I think, just last week saying that, Hamas has been virtually eradicated, apparently, in Gaza. I think they do misunderstand the notion of the resistance if they think that the elimination of Hamas is somehow going to eradicate the Palestinian people's will to resist occupation. But let's park that for a minute. But if there's no Hamas, which was the governing authority in Gaza, and the PA is completely compromised, where is Mahmoud Abbas? Has anyone seen Mahmoud Abbas? If we have neither of those kind of forms of leadership being able to speak on an international platform for Palestinians, how do you as a people, find a voice, find a united voice?
It's such an important question, and I think the best way to start answering it is, why do we not have that voice? What events and what decisions and what actions have been taken in recent history and over decades to divide us, the Palestinian people, geographically? West Bank, Gaza, diaspora, those who were forced to leave, myself included. Socially, politically, in Netanyahu helping create and fund and keep Hamas in power in Gaza, as we know he has done. So not to blame Israel or there is a lot of blame to be had for Palestinian leaders over the years who have made miscalculations and who are corrupt. These are not secrets. And it's important to look in the mirror. It's as important to look in the mirror as it is to look at the reasons why we've been so divided. But then you look at I was just, while you were speaking, I was trying to open up something that I had read about Marwan Barghouti, but, a political prisoner who's been in prison now for decades. I think he has managed to, despite all of Israel's attempts, to maintain a certain popular support that stratifies geography and stratifies political party in the Palestinian context. We don't have time to get into why and how he's done that, but I think and that's why he's in jail, obviously, and why he remains in jail. And I think we have suffered from a lack of unity and a unified approach with messaging in the political realm, but even in the media realm. And that's why I make it a point to try to work with other Palestinians, particularly in diaspora, to try to find a sort of agreed, set upon, prioritized arguments and narratives. Because, divide and conquer is a strategy that colonialism has employed to make the natives that they are ethnically cleansing all the weaker, and to make it happen more swiftly. But, they've been trying for 70-some years now, and almost 80 years. And they're going to fail in the end.
One question I wanted to ask you about is, obviously, we always hear this refrain of Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East.
Bullshit.
Yes, indeed. So let's talk a minute about the fact that there is an Israeli-Palestinian politician called Ayman Odeh, who recently wrote a really powerful op-ed, which you may have seen in Haaretz, where he and others call for freedom from occupation and equality for Palestinians and Jews. And he says they're being targeted for erasure in Israeli politics, people who make that call for equality. Now, he described how even a statement supporting the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons and calling for the liberation of both people today in Israel is twisted as support for terrorism by both government and opposition figures. How do you square this seeming contradiction? How do you make sense of this?
Look, Myriam, you and I both know that, again, in Israeli society, in Israeli culture, in the zeitgeist, in the media, in the political realm, Palestinians are less than. They are not equal human beings. So it's not a stretch for someone who tries to equate rights and dignity for Palestinian people with Jewish people to be perceived as a threat, because he is threatening the hierarchy and the supremacy of Judaism in the way that the Zionist state is defining it. And that's why I think you see so many young Jewish people around the world. And that's what I think really scares Israel. This new generation of people who see right through the veneer that you were describing, which is, there's this parliament and they can have equal representation. When I used to engage liberal Zionists more in conversation, something that always perplexed me is their inability to acknowledge the very obvious fact that under Israeli law, Jewish human beings enjoy more rights than non-Jewish human beings, and particularly Palestinian human beings. I mean, you don't have to be a genius or an academic or a lawyer or to just know that that's an observable fact.
Can you give us a couple of examples of like the most egregious ways in which there are differential apartheid-like laws operating within Israel despite it claiming to be a democracy?
Look at just freedom of movement. I mean, that's the most basic. Legal systems in which Palestinians are treated under a completely different legal system. I'm talking Palestinian citizens, just for clarity, of the state of Israel, right? Not the Palestinians who are occupied. These are supposed citizens of the only democracy in the Middle East. And legally, they're not beholden to the same legal systems. They're unable to move from one place to another. You see all these videos go viral by some young talented journalists who are Palestinian, where they're like, trying to go, just move to Bethlehem from another city. You can't do it, The stratification, water, I mean, basic human rights. You don't have the same right to resources. What people don't realize is like, Israel is the only, if I'm not mistaken, government in the world that tries children in military courts, and they do it frequently and often. I mean, this is not just a violation of international norms and legal norms. All these things should reveal to us that this is neither a democracy, nor is it a just society.
Well, and I want to come back on this children tried in military courts, because there is a report by Save the Children, the Save the Children 2025 report on the abuse of Palestinian children in Israeli detention, which has been causing a lot of ruckus online because actually the release has been delayed over and over.
Of course.
So let me read you this extract from last year's report. So each year, approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children come into contact with the Israeli military court system. They're the only children in the world to experience systematic prosecution in military courts. They are subject to serious and widespread abuse at the hands of those who are meant to be looking after them. This is children. Levels of violence have increased since stricter rules were introduced in October, blocking visits from parents or lawyers. Some children have reported broken bones and beatings. The government of Israel's blanket secrecy has left hundreds of families across Gaza and the occupied West Bank completely in the dark, unaware of where their children are. Can you imagine? Your child is disappeared and you have no idea what has happened to them. They have disappeared into this system where you have a track record of physical and sexual abuse. And they say whether they are safe, they don't know whether they are safe and the conditions and treatments that they're being subjected to. The report details Palestinian children reporting sexual assault, harassment, forced nudity, and violent abuse in Israeli detention. Practices described as decades-long child protection catastrophe. Beyond, obviously, the insanity of claims that this could be happening within anything like a democratic state, why has this type of abuse not only gone on for so long, but not really received the type of attention you'd expect from what is surely a huge scandal?
The same reason the number of Palestinian detainees and hostages, as I call them, who are raped don't receive attention. I mean, you may remember when Josh Paul was on Christiane Amanpour on CNN and revealed that, I think it was Defense for Children, the NGO, when they shared with the State Department of the US when he was there, that a Palestinian child had been raped in an Israeli prison by soldiers. And then they went to investigate it and they were able to confirm that it was in fact true. Do you know what happened the next day? The next day, Defense for Children, the NGO, was deemed a terrorist organization and shut down. They know that children are perceived as innocent inherently by the majority of people in the world. And it's the same reason that they have to lie and accuse Hamas and Palestinians of, attacking and wanting to kill our children and burn them in ovens and behead them, all these lies that have been proven to be lies, it's because, if this stuff is reported, if this is shared at face value, it could potentially lead people to see Israel for what it is. And that's why these are the things that are quickly deleted and erased from public record, as I think the most egregious form of it for me is the one that Josh Paul shared so blatantly. Yeah. 86%, I think, of Save the Children. You were reading last year's report, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
I think Save the Children also recently collected testimonies from hundreds of prisoners in Israeli jails. 86% reported beatings, 69% strip searches, and nearly half that were arrested. We know that when Israel, all those visuals that we saw of people being marched, much like the visuals of that match the visuals of the Holocaust, naked, only in their underwear, into these places. I mean, they use the boogeyman line of these are Hamas operatives to justify these war crimes. And oftentimes there are children in those lines.
Which we have identified in many pictures online.
Exactly.
But I mean, let's also just remind our viewers that even had they been prisoners of war, there are still rules.
And yet, no accountability. So there are these rules, but are they ever upheld when it is the colonial powers or the imperial powers or their Israel's, their satellite states committing them? No.
As you mentioned, in addition to the hundreds of children currently in Israeli custody, there are a total of around 10,000 Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank who are also detained, most without ever being formally charged or tried. Reports are showing they live in poor, inhumane conditions, overcrowded cells, beatings, lack of medication, isolation. We've also heard of incidents of rape, including one I was listening to this morning of a young man talking about his experience. Among those detained are some of the most revered medical figures from Gaza, people like Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who was the director of the Gamal Adwan Hospital. I don't still understand how the detention of so many people who are identified as civilians, people like Dr. Hussam, it's not like there's any ambiguity over his status.
Yeah.
I don't think even the Israelis are trying to claim he is Hamas. And yet, where is the international community when it comes to the release of these hostages?
Whether you're a journalist, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a child, whether you're a pregnant woman, whether you're a paramedic, whether you're anything, you're Palestinian first. And when the dehumanization is against Palestinians, that supersedes any other identifying factor that should guarantee you protection as a civilian or as a journalist. I mean, who have they not gone after, Myriam? And, you look at sort of the ratios. I forget the exact statistic, but it's like 10%. I mean, I think doctors are less than, or paramedics or doctors are less than 1% of the Palestinian population in Gaza, and yet they're over 10% or 11% of the victims of this genocide.
I mean, worth investigating that fact, maybe? I don't know.
And that's not accidental. You want to erase, and again, people, they say, well, you say that you want, they say they want to erase future generations, right? They say they want that Palestinian children are a target. They go after Palestinian women and children. They target the paramedics and the doctors, especially the ones that work in neonatal care. I mean, it's not like, they accidentally killed these people because they bombed a hospital and it was collateral damage as the mainstream media. These are deliberate strategic tactics to prevent Palestinian life. And one of our weapons, as is often referred to, is that we are procreating, that we are copulating.
Imagine that.
Yeah. I mean, that's what happens when you live in this, open air prison. And that's what happens when the world allows and facilitates ethnic cleansing for decades. You have to turn to, life is our weapon. Death is their weapon.
And the maddest thing is those of us who accept to be complicit in those systems do so without realizing that in degrading the value of anyone's life, we make ourselves vulnerable to that at some point in the future when somebody decides that you also are actually less valuable than their profits. So good luck to all of you CEOs sat on all of those boards, because someday, I know they don't think it'll happen, but it will be them, it'll be their kids, it'll be their families.
Yeah. And that's what's happening in America with Palantir. It's very easy to feel like what's happening in Palestine and Israel, for those of us in the West who live in the West who don't necessarily have ties to that part of the world. Oh, it's over there. It's horrible. It's war. There's always war there. But the war is being facilitated, enabled, enacted by the corporations that are simultaneously signing these huge billion-dollar contracts with the US government, with other governments in Europe, in order to create databases where not only will we be and are being surveilled, but wherein we will be much more easy to be coerced, to be targeted. And I think we're now coming full circle. I mean, you think it'll happen only to those people, but eventually it'll happen to you.
Right. And I think interestingly, the US citizenship issue is a very good example of the very quick and sliding slope of ignoring when they came for those more vulnerable people. And now they're definitely coming for you too. Let me end by asking you about hope, if I may.
Yeah.
So a group of 12 global South countries named the Hague Group implemented a steps to hold Israel accountable. This morning, I was listening to the Colombian president, Petro Gustavo, say Gaza is an experiment by the mega rich trying to show all the peoples of the world how to respond to a rebellion of humanity. Do you have any hope that these initiatives, these global South organizations can find a way to hold these very powerful countries to account, create the basis for a new system of accountability? Is there any hope to be found there?
There has to be hope. So my answer is yes, because without hope, what's the point? That said, and it's people like Francesca who give me hope. And it's not just her. There are millions like her. And that's where I find hope. I find hope in myself when I'm in my deepest, darkest moments, when I feel despair, when I'm tired, when the diabolical nature of the government's actions in Israel or wherever, it might be, seems so overwhelming. I find hope in myself. I find hope in you. I find hope in people who are willing to make a small sacrifice every day, whatever that sacrifice might be, where you choose to spend your money, who you choose to associate with, what you say to the person in power that you happen to meet at your friend's gathering. I find hope in the people who are willing to challenge the status quo, as Francesca does so effectively, which is why she is the first UN official to be sanctioned. I find hope particularly in Jewish people who use their relative privilege and at a cost to them individually. Their families maybe don't talk to them anymore, or their friends view them as traitors. But they inspire me, and my darkest moments I would be lying. A lot of Palestinians say to me, "Why do you often amplify the voices of like white people or Jewish people? We don't need them to advocate for us. We don't." And I get the sentiment. I get the emotional response there. I feel it too. That said, we do need them, and we need each other. And the minute we start to see ourselves as separate from them, the minute we perpetuate the divisions that powerful people use to exploit us and keep us all oppressed, even if at various sort of levels of oppression. Jewish people, white people, we need each other to feel hope. You can't have hope for change without people. All I'm trying to say is like we need people more than we ever have before if we have a chance at challenging the few that are in power that are oppressing us.
I think it's a very interesting conclusion that you've reached on that at a time where there is a big pushback against identity politics as a form of division that, has us squabbling amongst ourselves about ultimately, our, universal failure to fully comprehend the forms of oppression that individual groups experience. Like, I'll never know what it means to be a Palestinian man.
Sure.
You'll never know what it means to be a woman. Right? But that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, we can still talk about it.
But I still rep my women, and I rep their rights, and I show up. And if we don't show up for each other, then we end up stratified and alone.
Right. I will say this. I will say that as somebody who's spent a long time talking about whiteness, I do think that we have a responsibility as people from the majority in Western nations, as white people, who benefit from a level of, I'm not going to even use the word privilege, because I think a lot of people irk at that term. I'm going to use the word,
I know what you mean,
leeway. So when we are in a discussion, I'm going to use the word discussion very broadly here.
I know what you're saying. With
authorities, there is a level of leeway that we have that brown and black people do not. There is an ability to wield authority and power that white people have in dominant white settings that black and brown people do not have. At this moment, we have a responsibility to leverage that small additional space that we have to push back before you get arrested. Because between the two of us, I'm a bet that if the police were to come right now, you'd be the first to go. I might be second, but I have extra second or two. And my point is that as white people in this moment, we have to grab that extra second or two to push for more space than our colleagues on the front lines are able to push for.
I mean, I feel like it's an extra hour or two that white people
may well
have.
be.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But look, there's hope. When people who, as you say, have those relative, even I have relative privileges, even just my ability to speak the colonizer's language, as it were, better than someone perhaps from Palestine who suffered and endured more and might be more credible as a primary source for what's happening on the ground, but they're not going to be given the leeway that I will on mainstream channel number one.
Right.
Do you get what I mean?
Absolutely.
Even though I'm also Palestinian and I'm also brown.
Right.
You know what I mean? So these relative leeways are really important. I appreciate you saying that, because the first step to them is to know that you have them.
Right.
And some people don't know that, or they don't focus on it. They're not aware of what that gives them, even if it is a second, whether it's a second or an hour. You know what I mean?
Right. And the tipping point of a lot of movements happen when it's white people who are prepared to get arrested, right? It's when white middle-class kids end up having to be bailed out by their middle-class parents.
Vietnam.
And so, we have to learn from those historical moments that actually there is an additional responsibility that those of us at the center of empire have. A lot of people right now are talking about feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, not knowing what to do. I disagree with that profoundly. We literally have the greatest proximity to those centers of power, first and foremost in America, but also here in the West, the UK and elsewhere. And we have more power than anybody else in these settings to, not just hold our leaders accountable, but put our bodies and our freedoms on the line in a struggle that goes far beyond Palestine today. Far beyond Palestine. Palestine is, as our dear friend Noura Erakat refers to Palestinians as the canaries in the coal mine. Let us never forget that what we're learning from the Palestinian movement is awakening us all to the reality of our situations. And so you can choose to join it now on the Palestinian issue, or you can wait 5 years till it comes to your door. I'm going to suggest you start now.
Amen.
Ahmed, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. At The Tea, we are passionate about bringing you unique and meaningful discussions that aren't always in the spotlight. If you believe in what we're doing, hit that subscribe button and join us on Patreon. Until next time, stay awake, support independent content, and we'll see you soon for more tea. Thanks for watching The Tea. Please remember to like and subscribe. And if you've made it this far, why not keep going and check out this episode?